In this powerful story, a successful black CEO is subjected to blatant racism when two police officers, based solely on her race, harass and intimidate her in a public setting. Despite her calm demeanor and attempts to remain composed, she is followed, belittled, and unfairly targeted. The officers' actions expose deep systemic bias, with their behavior escalating as they treat her with growing hostility. The story highlights the everyday reality of racism in America, showcasing how racial prejudices and abuse of power can destroy a person's dignity, leaving the protagonist fighting to reclaim control. It was a crisp fall morning when Tasha Wallace stepped into the local diner, a small establishment nestled on the edge of a town that had long since faded into the backdrop of urban sprawl. She didn't mind it, though in fact she preferred places like this, places where the world moved slower, where the noise of fame and fortune couldn't quite reach. Tasha was used to the hum of high-end boardrooms, the glitter of gala events, and the endless press of high society. As the CEO of a rapidly growing tech company, she commanded the kind of influence most could only dream of, but that was not who she was, at least not all of her. Not today. Today, she was just Tasha, the woman in the oversized sweater and the worn-out jeans, sitting down at a booth by the window, content to sip her coffee and enjoy a moment of quiet. The air inside the diner was warm, the smell of eggs and bacon wafting in the air, as regulars greeted each other with easy smiles. The chatter was light, almost friendly. A couple of locals were hunched over the counter, reading their newspapers, the kind of people who didn't think much about the billionaire woman who ran a multi-million-dollar company. No one here knew who she was, and for once, she was glad. As she sat with her coffee, she pulled out her phone and flicked through her emails, her finger scrolling slowly, deliberately. The words on the screen blurred into background noise as her mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her assistant earlier. The pressure, the expectations, the constant battle to prove herself in a world that was never sure what to do with a black woman at the top. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way, but today, in this small-town diner, it felt heavier than usual. The weight of all that she had built, the quiet expectations that she couldn't stop, but continued to exceed, the walls she kept running into, all of it began to gnaw at her. A soft chime pulled her back to the present. She glanced up as a waitress approached, her smile warm and easy as she slid a menu in front of Tasha. "You here for the usual, hun?" the waitress asked, her voice light, casual. Tasha smiled. It was clear that the woman didn't recognize her, and for a fleeting moment, Tasha felt a strange sense of relief. "I'll just have the pancakes and scrambled eggs, thanks." The waitress gave her a friendly nod before turning away, her movements easy and unhurried. Tasha let her gaze drift back to the window, watching a couple of children chase each other in the street outside. It was a peaceful, almost nostalgic scene. The town felt miles away from the frenetic pace of the corporate world she inhabited. But even here, she knew, there were things lurking in the shadows of everyday life. Tasha had spent enough time fighting against biases, both subtle and overt, to understand that not everyone appreciated the success she had earned. There were whispers, the sideways glances when she entered a room, and the assumption that her accomplishments had come from something other than her brilliance and hard work. Tasha had been raised to never let those things get to her, but some days it felt impossible to ignore. Here she was, in a place where no one knew her name, hoping for a moment of normalcy, and yet she could still sense it, the way the world subtly shifted around her, as though she had to constantly prove she belonged. As she stared out the window, the waitress returned with her meal. The plate was set down gently in front of her, the pancakes steaming just enough to fog the glass. Tasha smiled her thanks, and the woman walked away, the familiar clink of the coffee cups and the sizzle of the grill behind the counter, adding to the easy rhythm of the diner. Just as she picked up her fork, the door opened, and a man walked in, a regular by the looks of it. He was tall, with a white button-up shirt, a dark jacket, and the kind of swagger that came with someone used to being taken seriously. He glanced over the room and froze for a moment when his eyes landed on Tasha. His gaze was sharp, scrutinizing, before he looked away quickly. He walked to the counter and ordered his usual. It wasn't the first time she had encountered such looks. This wasn't a town that welcomed outsiders, let alone a woman who didn't look like everyone else. Tasha had learned to live with these small moments, the undercurrent of judgment that swam just beneath the surface. But today, it felt different. The way he had looked at her, it wasn't casual. It wasn't even curiosity. It was more like he had seen her but refused to acknowledge her presence, as if it was unworthy of notice. She didn't know what it was, but something in the way the man had sized her up felt unnerving. His discomfort was palpable, and it made her uncomfortable too. Tasha looked down at her plate, pushing a few of the scrambled eggs around, her mind whirling. Was she imagining it? Or had something subtle shifted in the air since the man had walked in? She tried to shake it off. The weight of the world was enough to bear without adding unnecessary stress, but as she finished her meal, she couldn't help but notice how his eyes seemed to flicker back to her every now and then, when he thought she wasn't paying attention. When he left, he didn't say a word to her, didn't even look her way. He just paid his bill and walked out the door. Tasha exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. There was no point in reading too much into it. People had their prejudices. She'd come to understand that over the years, had made peace with it in some ways. But moments like this, moments when someone looked at her with that special mix of suspicion and contempt, still caught her off guard. The waitress came back with the check, and Tasha paid with a soft smile, leaving a generous tip. As she stood up, she felt a strange sense of awareness, as though all eyes were suddenly on her. Even though no one had directly spoken to her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been the subject of a conversation she wasn't privy to. Tasha walked out of the diner, her heels clicking against the pavement, her thoughts swirling. She needed a moment of quiet, away from the prying eyes, away from the constant weight of expectations. But she also knew that this was something she couldn't escape forever. She was here now, a successful black woman who had built an empire from scratch, and with that came responsibilities, not just to herself, but to the people watching her, to those who needed someone to stand up for them when they couldn't. As she walked to her car, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of a nearby window. For a brief moment, she saw the woman everyone saw, the CEO, the leader, the one who had made it in a world that wasn't always built for people like her. But beneath that, there was something else. Something that was hard to name but couldn't be ignored. Something that told her this moment, this encounter, was the beginning of something larger. Tasha paused beside her car in the parking lot, the events inside the diner still playing on loop in her mind. She had been trying to ignore it, the strange unease, the brief but pointed stare of the man at the counter. The small-town tension she was so used to, that subtle feeling of always being out of place, despite how well she fit in every other part of her life. But today, something felt different. She closed the door of her car and slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, and as she pulled out of the lot, she reminded herself to focus. She had a meeting with her board later that afternoon. Important work that could set the trajectory for the next phase of her company's growth. But today, as her fingers gripped the wheel a little tighter than usual, the weight of the microaggressions she had felt earlier pressed harder against her chest. In the back of her mind, the man in the diner remained, an embodiment of the uncomfortable familiarity of being overlooked and underestimated. He didn't say anything outright, but the way he studied her, the look of dismissive disdain in his eyes, was enough. It was always like this, the subtle undercurrent of racism that didn't scream its ugliness but simmered quietly beneath the surface, like a slow poison. She could feel it more keenly now, as she drove toward her office, the invisible walls pushing in on her. She had long ago learned to play the game, mastering the art of looking confident, of projecting success. But the truth was, despite the polished exterior and the power she wielded, being a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated world meant that she had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email reminder about her meeting, and she sighed, realizing she'd been distracted. She had to keep it together. Tasha had learned that no one ever saw the weight she carried, the sacrifices, the mental toll. They only saw the CEO, the powerful woman running a billion-dollar tech company. But what they didn't see was the quiet fear that she had learned to push down, to suppress, every time she walked into a new room. Tasha's office building came into view. She parked in the garage and took a deep breath, trying to clear her head before stepping into the meeting. The building's sleek glass exterior mirrored her own polished image. successful, composed, a far cry from the woman who had just been stared down by a stranger in a small-town diner. The elevator ride up was a brief moment of silence, broken only by the soft chime of floors being passed. Tasha adjusted her jacket, running through her presentation in her mind. By the time she reached the boardroom, she was ready to face the challenges of the day. Her team would be there, and they depended on her to lead. She couldn't let the day's microaggressions overshadow what needed to be done, but as she walked into the room, a subtle shift in the air told her something was off. The room fell quiet when she entered. Some of her board members gave her a brief nod or a smile. Others, like Kenneth, and his ever-smug look, shifted in their seats, waiting for her to take charge. It was always like this with Kenneth, a man whose contributions were lauded far more than hers. Despite her hard work in building the company, she had learned not to mind the little things, but today, it grated more than usual. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said with a smile, though her voice didn't carry the usual warmth. Her eyes flicked to Kenneth. "Let's dive right in," she continued, setting her bag down and flipping open her tablet, ready to begin the meeting. The team launched into the discussion, but even as she steered the conversation with her usual poise, she couldn't shake the feeling of being quietly dismissed. Kenneth's voice, always a bit too loud, kept interrupting her, speaking over her ideas, redirecting the conversation in ways that subtly erased her contributions. She could see it clearly now. Kenneth, an older white man with a good old boy attitude, was used to being in charge. He believed he had the right to talk over her, to dismiss her ideas, because to him, her success was just a fluke, a part of a token gesture to include diversity, without actually allowing it to affect the way business was done. At one point, he even leaned over to one of the other board members and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Tasha could feel her stomach twist. She knew what they were talking about. She had seen it before. The looks, the glances that said more than words ever could. "I think we can consider those numbers next quarter," she said, trying to regain control of the meeting. But it was as if no one was listening. Even when she spoke, her voice seemed to disappear into the space between them. Tasha felt the frustration rising inside her, but she kept her composure. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with men like Kenneth, people who underestimated her based on the color of her skin and her gender. "Actually," she said, cutting through the tension, "I'd like to point out something important here. We're overlooking a crucial opportunity in the market." She flipped through the slides she had prepared, her eyes scanning the data, her voice growing stronger with every word. "This," she pointed to the graph on the screen, "is where we should be focusing our energy. This is what will keep us ahead of our competitors. Let's not waste time on the small stuff." She kept her gaze steady, unwilling to let Kenneth's condescension or the subtle undermining from the others derail her. She watched their faces as she spoke. The room was quiet, but not in a respectful way. It was the silence of discomfort, of people trying to figure out how to deal with the black woman who had so skillfully earned her place at the table. The minutes ticked by, and Tasha fought to maintain the calm facade, even as her pulse quickened. She could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface, but she kept it in check. She had to. She had worked too hard to get here. Her place was earned, not given. The discussion went on, but the tension was palpable. It was in the air, thick like smoke. Kenneth continued to cut her off, interrupting her ideas with suggestions that weren't as well thought out, but Tasha's resolve remained firm. She would not back down, not today. As the meeting progressed, it became more apparent that some of the other board members were beginning to back Kenneth's suggestions, despite the obvious flaws in his logic. It was as though they couldn't, or wouldn't, see her point. At one point, she noticed one of the younger members of the team, Emily, eyeing her with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. Tasha's gaze met hers, and Emily quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. Tasha had seen this before too, the subtle, unconscious bias that many didn't even realize they carried. It was easy for people like Emily, someone just starting her career, to defer to the older, more seasoned voices in the room, especially the ones who had the cultural and social capital to maintain dominance. But she was tired of it. She was tired of waiting for people to see her as capable, to see her as worthy. She had earned her place at the table. This wasn't just a seat she was given. It was one she had taken. "Look," Tasha said, her voice cutting through the room, finally breaking the unspoken tension. We're either going to innovate, or we're going to stagnate. We can't keep doing things the way we always have because we're comfortable. We have the opportunity to lead, not just follow. Her gaze swept the room, her eyes settling on Kenneth, whose face was starting to redden. He opened his mouth to argue, but she raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm not interested in arguing, I'm interested in results. The room was still now, everyone waiting for someone else to speak, to address the elephant in the room. But there was nothing more to say. Tasha knew this wasn't over. She had made her point, but the battle wasn't just in that boardroom, it was everywhere. This would take time, and more importantly, it would take a strategy she hadn't fully mapped out. But she wasn't leaving today without making sure her voice was heard, even if it was the only one in the room standing against the tide. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, press conferences, and strategies to keep her company at the top. Tasha tried to bury the tension of that board meeting deep within herself, focusing on the business at hand, but the sense of urgency in the air, of being watched, of not being heard, lingered like a shadow. It was a slow burn, but it was growing stronger, more suffocating. On Friday afternoon, as she sat in her office preparing for the next big pitch meeting, her phone buzzed. The message from the number she didn't recognize made her stomach drop. We're watching you. You're not untouchable. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, the words staring back at her. She had been expecting something like this, but the suddenness of it rattled her. No matter how much she told herself she was used to being the target of bias, that she was strong enough to handle it, this still felt different. This felt like something bigger. Her mind raced. Who would send a message like this? Was it just another cowardly attempt to intimidate her, or was it something more? The threatening tone was enough to make her feel cornered, vulnerable. There were already enough people who tried to minimize her achievements, dismiss her as someone who didn't belong, who couldn't possibly have earned her seat at the table. But now, this felt like a physical manifestation of that bias, a message telling her to stop pushing, to stay in her place. She quickly dialed Mitchell, her longtime ally, and one of the few people who truly understood the uphill battle she faced every day. He answered after the second ring, his voice immediately concerned. Tasha? What's going on? I just got another message. It's from an unknown number. We're watching you. You're not untouchable. Her voice shook despite her efforts to sound calm. Mitchell was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of what she'd said. He knew her well enough to hear the edge in her voice. Damn, this is escalating. What are you going to do? Tasha took a deep breath, pushing the rising panic down. She had to stay composed. She was the face of her company, the one people looked to for strength, for leadership. She had spent years building a reputation, proving herself time and time again. But now, with every passing day, it felt like the rug was being pulled out from under her. I don't know, I'm trying to figure it out, she said. I don't want to blow this up. I don't want to make it worse than it already is, but I'm not going to let them scare me either. Mitchell's voice softened. You've already taken the high road, but I get it. This is starting to feel like it's more than just isolated incidents. You've got too much riding on this, but don't face it alone. She sighed, her eyes drifting toward the city skyline outside her office window. The towering glass buildings reflected her own image, strong, determined, but now seemingly fragile in the face of an unseen enemy. I'm not alone, I've got you. She hung up with a heavy heart. The weight of what she was up against felt like it was pushing down on her chest, but she knew she couldn't let it break. Her Tasha had fought to get where she was, and no amount of intimidation was going to change that. As the hours passed, the phone buzzed again, this time with an email. It was from the same unknown number. Tasha's hand trembled slightly as she opened the message, but what she read made her blood run cold. If you think you're safe in that office, think again, you're a target now. Just like everyone else who dares to rise above their station, you've been warned. It was the same cryptic message, only more menacing now. A clear escalation. Tasha stared at the screen for a long moment, her mind racing. What was this? Who was behind it? And why was this happening to her? Suddenly, her door swung open, breaking her from her thoughts. Mitchell stepped inside, his face set in determination. He was no stranger to the pressures Tasha faced. He'd been by her side during countless struggles, from the boardroom to personal setbacks, but even he couldn't mask the concern in his eyes now. "Tasha, we need to talk," he said, shutting the door behind him and sitting across from her. His voice was urgent, and his tone softened. "I know you've been holding it together, but it's serious. This is bigger than what we thought." Tasha looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel it too." He leaned in, his elbows resting on the table. "We need to get ahead of this. You can't let it keep going on like this. We've worked too hard to get here." Tasha's mind flashed to the events of the past few weeks. The quiet stares in the boardroom, the subtle comments, the undercurrent of racism in every meeting, every interaction. But this was different. This felt like a targeted campaign, a message meant to shake her, to silence her. "I don't know what to do, Mitchell," she said, her voice soft but filled with frustration. "I've worked so hard, built everything from scratch, and now it feels like I'm just being pushed back into a corner. I can't just ignore it anymore. But I also don't want to cause a scene." Mitchell's expression softened, and he placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to face this alone. I'm with you, every step of the way. But you can't let them break you." Tasha looked up at him, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let them win. Not this time, not after everything she had fought for. "I've spent my whole life trying to do everything right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But it's never been enough. This system, this world, it's never been enough. And now it's time to take a stand. They want to intimidate me. Fine. But I'm not backing down." Her words hung in the air between them, filled with conviction. Mitchell's eyes glinted with respect, but there was a hint of worry in his gaze too. He knew what Tasha was facing, and the stakes were high. Too high for her to take this on alone. But this wasn't just about the company anymore. This was about her fight for dignity, for recognition, for her right to be seen. "I'll make a few calls," Mitchell said. "But we need a strategy. We need to expose this, get ahead of them." Tasha nodded, the storm inside her chest intensifying. "Let's do it. Let's show them that I'm not afraid. This stops now." With that, the two of them worked quickly to map out their next steps. They would reach out to allies, gather information, and make sure her story was heard, loud and clear. But even as they prepared, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking just around the corner. Something bigger, something more dangerous. That evening, after the meeting, Tasha made her way home, her mind spinning. As she walked to the elevator in her building, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the lobby, a man she had known for years, an influential businessman in the community. They exchanged pleasantries, but there was a strange tension in the air between them. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Before she could ask him what was on his mind, he turned away abruptly, walking past her without another word. Tasha's stomach churned as she watched him go. It felt like a silent signal, like the walls were closing in on her. The elevator doors opened, and Tasha stepped inside, her hand shaking slightly as she pressed the button for her floor. She looked up at her reflection in the shiny metal doors and took a deep breath. There was no going back now. The fight had only just begun. With the stakes higher than ever, Tasha knew her next move would have to be decisive. The tension was reaching its peak, and she was ready to take the fight to those who had tried to break her. The system may have underestimated her, but she wasn't backing down. Tasha's pulse quickened as she exited her office building. The sun was setting behind the city's skyline, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. But there was no time to admire the view. The message from the anonymous number still weighed heavily on her mind. "You're not untouchable." She felt like she was living in the shadow of something dark, something ominous that was slowly creeping closer. She had hoped that with her status, her wealth, her influence, she would be insulated from the more insidious parts of the system. But the more she fought for fairness, the more she uncovered just how entrenched the biases were. Her wealth hadn't shielded her from hatred, and her success had only served to highlight the inequities of a system that was never built for people like her. Tasha took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She had fought her way up in a world that had constantly told her she didn't belong, that she wasn't supposed to be at the top. Now that she had finally carved out her place, she wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how powerful, push her back down. Tonight, she was meeting with Mitchell again. He'd called her earlier, urgency in his voice. He had news that had forced him to act fast. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew it wasn't good. She arrived at the small cafe they'd agreed on, the dim lighting and the buzz of conversation doing little to mask the anxiety that churned in her stomach. Mitchell was already seated at a corner table when she walked in, his face drawn tight with concern. He had the look of someone who had just faced down a difficult truth and wasn't sure how to handle it. "You're looking more serious than usual," Tasha remarked, as she slid into the seat across from him, trying to lighten the mood, though the weight of the situation made it nearly impossible. Mitchell didn't smile. "Tasha, it's bad. We've been digging into Daniel's background. He's not just some rogue officer. There's a system backing him. There's a network of people who are invested in keeping things the way they are, and those people are watching you." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it aloud, confirmed, sent a jolt of fear through her chest. "Who are we talking about, Mitchell?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would make it all the more real. "People higher up than just Daniel's people who've been covering for him for years," Mitchell replied, his voice grim. "And it's not just about you anymore. It's about silencing anyone who challenges the status quo. The message they're sending, they're not afraid to go after you, especially not now." Tasha's mind spun. The message she'd received, the surveillance, the feeling that something was watching her. It all began to make sense. She had become a symbol, a threat to a system that had been allowed to function unchecked for far too long. But she hadn't just fought for her place at the table. She'd fought for everyone who had been overlooked, ignored, and oppressed. And now, the very system she had defied was trying to tear her down. "What's their endgame?" Tasha asked, her voice hardening as she leaned forward, her jaw set with determination. "Public humiliation. Get you to back down. It's like a pressure campaign. They want you to be afraid, to second-guess every move you make. To doubt yourself," Mitchell said. "But the more you resist, the harder they'll push. I think they'll make a move soon. One that you won't be able to ignore." The words sent a wave of dread through her. But she couldn't let herself be paralyzed by it. Tasha had fought her whole life to rise above these systems of oppression. To let fear stop her now would undo everything she had worked for. "I'm not going to give them that power," Tasha said, her voice steady and fierce. "I've spent too long trying to do things by the book, trying to appease people who will never see me as equal. It's time to fight back, Mitchell. I'm not hiding anymore." Mitchell's eyes searched hers, weighing her resolve. He knew that Tasha was the kind of woman who didn't back down from a fight. But even he understood the stakes now. This wasn't just about her career. It was about survival. And it wasn't just her life that was on the line. It was the message she sent when she stood up to an oppressive system. "Tasha, you've got more power than you realize," Mitchell said quietly. "But you can't do this alone. The system is too big, too deep. If you want to bring them down, you'll need to go public." Tasha met his gaze, the fire in her eyes a reflection of her unyielding determination. "I've already been public. I've already fought for the rights of people like me, for the future we deserve, and I'll continue to fight, but I need your help. I need to know everything, every last detail about what's going on behind closed doors." Mitchell nodded, understanding. "I'll get the information, but it won't be easy. There's a lot of risk involved." "I'm ready," Tasha replied, standing up. "Let's make this public. We'll take this fight straight to them. Let's see how they like it." The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, investigative work, and strategy. Mitchell's contacts pulled every string they could, and Tasha's team worked tirelessly to uncover the extent of the corruption. Daniel's was just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Bribes, abuse of power, racial profiling at the highest levels. Tasha knew they couldn't let it stop with just exposing Daniel's. It was about the whole system. A system that had perpetuated this injustice for far too long. But every time they thought they had enough evidence, someone within the system would shut them down, push them back, make it clear that they didn't belong. At the same time, the threats kept coming. Anonymous messages, strange encounters at her office, police surveillance, each one more blatant than the last. Tasha refused to back down, but the fear in the pit of her stomach grew heavier with every passing day. Mitchell, though supportive, began to express concern. "Tasha, we can't do this on our own anymore," he said one evening, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We need allies, people who will go public with us, people with power." "I know," Tasha replied, her mind spinning. "But if we go too public too soon, it could ruin everything. We have to be careful. Every move counts now." Mitchell paused, then sighed, his shoulders slumping. "But Tasha, they're going to try to make sure this never sees the light of day. They'll stop at nothing to keep the system intact." Tasha nodded, her face set in determination. "Then we'll make them see it. We'll make them feel it." As they prepared for the press conference that would expose everything they had uncovered, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger. But she couldn't stop now. The day of the press conference arrived, and Tasha stood backstage, her heart racing. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, and the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. This was the moment. The moment she would either win or lose the fight against the corruption she had spent her entire life battling. She took a deep breath and walked out on stage, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The room fell silent as she took the microphone. She could feel the eyes of the world on her. "Tasha, what can you tell us about the allegations?" one reporter asked, her voice sharp with curiosity. Tasha met the reporter's gaze, her voice steady. "Today, I am here to expose a system that has been corrupt for far too long, a system that has allowed people like Officer Daniels to abuse their power, to racially profile innocent individuals, and to silence those who fight for justice. But I'm not here just for myself. I'm here for every person who has been oppressed. Every person who has been made to feel like they don't belong, like they don't matter." The words were out now. The truth was in the air, hanging heavy around her. But as Tasha spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Outside, across the street, there were shadows in the crowd. Men she didn't recognize, men who were clearly not there for the press conference. Her pulse quickened. The press conference was far from over, but Tasha could feel the tension rising. She had no idea what was coming next. Would this lead to the change she had worked for, or would it be the moment everything fell apart? As her final words echoed in the room, the tension was unbearable. There was no turning back now. Tasha stood in the heart of the press conference room, a sea of cameras and flashing lights surrounding her. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but she refused to buckle. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had suffered under the boot of systemic oppression, every person who had been silenced and pushed aside. She had made the decision. Now she had to follow through, no matter the consequences. The murmurs of the press died down as Tasha stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. The reporters sat in eager silence, their pens poised, their cameras trained on her. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Today is not just another press conference," Tasha began, her voice steady, carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room. "Today is a turning point, a chance to hold those in power accountable for their actions. I stand here not only for myself, but for all those whose voices have been drowned out by a corrupt system. For too long, those who have the power to make change have turned a blind eye, letting injustice flourish, but no more." Her words hung in the air, and the crowd remained silent, hanging on her every syllable. She could feel the eyes of the public upon her, both those in the room and those watching at home. This was her moment. The moment to make the truth undeniable. "Tasha, what can you tell us about Officer Daniels?" a reporter asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Tasha hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The name of Officer Daniels burned in her mind, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. He was just a pawn in a much larger game, one that had been played for decades, if not centuries. But today, Tasha was going to expose him for what he was: a coward, a bigot, and a symbol of the system that needed to change. "Officer Daniels," Tasha said, her voice now firm, "is the face of a larger issue. His actions were not those of a rogue officer, but the actions of someone who believed they could act with impunity, that their badge gave them the right to harass, humiliate, and intimidate innocent people. Her eyes locked on the camera lenses, daring anyone to look away. "But I'm here to tell you, Daniels is not untouchable. His actions will have consequences." The room buzzed with energy, the reporters exchanging glances, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. But before Tasha could continue, the door to the room creaked open. The tension in the air shifted as a familiar figure stepped into the room. Officer Daniels. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't supposed to be here. She had hoped that he would be miles away, somewhere out of sight, out of mind. But there he was, walking towards her, with the same smug expression that had haunted her thoughts since their last encounter. His eyes were cold, calculating, and it was clear that he had no intention of letting her take the lead in this fight. "Nice to see you, Miss Andrews," Daniel said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "It's cute that you think you can take down the system just because you've had a few headlines. You don't have the power you think you do." Tasha's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She stood taller, her back straight, her fists clenched at her sides. This was the moment. This was where she would make it clear that she wasn't afraid, that she wasn't backing down. "I'm not here to take down the system, Officer Daniels," Tasha replied, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm here to expose it, and to make sure that people like you, people who think they can get away with murder, face the consequences." Daniel's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You have no idea what's at stake here. You think you can just waltz in, throw some accusations around, and the whole world will bow to you. That's not how it works, sweetheart." The word sweetheart hung in the air, an insult wrapped in a veneer of false politeness. Tasha's blood boiled, but she held her ground. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, belittled, and treated as less than. "Let me make something clear," Tasha said, her voice low but filled with an undeniable force. "You may think you can intimidate me, but you can't. You're not the first person who's tried, and you won't be the last. But I promise you this. The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." Daniels took a step closer, his face now inches from hers. "You think this is just about me, don't you? You think I'm the problem, but you're wrong. There's a whole network of people behind this. People who don't care about you, about your story, about your so-called fight. You're nothing more than a pawn in their game, Tasha. And that's where you'll stay." The revelation hit her like a ton of bricks. A network. Tasha's mind raced as the implications settled. In Daniels wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. This wasn't just about racism in a police department. It was about an entire system that had been built to protect the powerful and oppress the vulnerable. But Tasha wasn't backing down. The stakes were higher than ever, and if she was going to fight, she was going to do it on her terms. "Is that what this is about, Daniels?" she asked, her voice now steely with determination. You're scared that the truth will come out, that people like me will stand up and say enough is enough. Well, I'm not going anywhere, and neither are the people I fight for. You may have a network behind you, but you've just made a huge mistake. You've underestimated me, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what you've done." The room was silent, as Tasha and Daniels locked eyes, the tension so thick that it seemed to suffocate everyone around them. But then, something shifted in the air. A sense of purpose. A resolve that Tasha hadn't known she was capable of. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his smug expression faltering for the first time. He knew that he was losing control of the situation. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. "Get out of my way!" Daniels hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But Tasha didn't flinch. She wasn't going anywhere. This was her moment, and she was going to take it. "Make me," Tasha challenged, her voice rising with the weight of every word. Daniels hesitated, his face flushed with rage. He was no longer in control, and that was something he couldn't handle. But before he could lash out, the door to the room swung open again, and two men entered, their presence almost as commanding as Tasha's. Mitchell and his colleague, a former lawyer turned activist, had arrived. They were the cavalry, the reinforcements Tasha had been waiting for. Daniel's eyes flicked to them, his posture stiffening. He knew who they were, and he knew that their arrival meant the end of his power in this room. "I think it's time for you to go, Officer Daniels," Tasha said, her voice calm but filled with an unmistakable authority. "You've made your point, but your time is up." Daniels took a step back, his face contorted with rage, but there was nothing more he could do. His secrets were out, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. The weight of his own corruption had finally caught up with him. As Daniels turned and stormed out of the room, Tasha felt a rush of victory surge through her, but she knew this was only the beginning. There was still more to be done, more battles to be fought, more truths to uncover. But for the first time in a long while, Tasha felt like she was on the right path. She had faced down the system, stared it in the face, and refused to back down. The fight wasn't over yet, but she had made it clear that she wasn't going to be silenced. And as she watched Daniels retreat, Tasha knew one thing for certain: she was going to win this fight. The question now was just how far the system would go to try and stop her. Tasha's hands were clammy as she stood at the edge of the room, her eyes trained on the door. This was it. The moment that she had been preparing for had finally arrived. After months of fighting, after facing intimidation, threats, and systemic discrimination, she was finally standing in front of the man who had wronged her, Officer Daniels. He had been the face of her nightmare, the man who had not only humiliated her, but had also been a part of the deeper corruption that festered within the system. Now, in the same room, the weight of his actions seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. He had no idea what was about to unfold. Tasha wasn't alone. Mitchell, the journalist who had helped her expose the truth, stood at her side, his presence a calm reassurance. They had done the research, gathered the evidence, and now they were ready to confront Daniels in the most public way possible. They had brought him to the courthouse, the very place where justice was supposed to be served. But Tasha knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about confronting him, it was about something much larger. Her fight had never been just about her. It was about every person who had been wrongly accused, treated unjustly, or overlooked because of the color of their skin. It was about breaking the chains of systemic racism, no matter how tightly they were wrapped. As the door opened and Officer Daniels stepped in, his tall frame filling the doorway, a chill ran through the room. He looked much the same as he had that fateful day in the grocery store, broad-shouldered, a scowl etched permanently on his face, his uniform sharply pressed, as if to assert his dominance. He didn't bother to make eye contact with Tasha, his eyes avoiding hers like he was somehow too good to even acknowledge her presence. "Ms. Andrews," Daniels said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I see you've been busy, but you should know, not everything that's been written about me is accurate. You think you can just walk in here and throw accusations around, but that's not how the world works." Tasha stood tall, her heart pounding, but she held her ground. She didn't flinch, didn't let his words break her focus. She had prepared for this. It was time to turn the tables. "Officer Daniels," Tasha began, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "What you don't understand is that you are not untouchable. Your actions have consequences, and the lies you've spun to protect yourself, well, they've caught up with you." Mitchell glanced at Tasha, his brow furrowed. The room was thick with anticipation. Every word Tasha said carried weight. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, waiting for her next move. And for the first time in this battle, she felt the power of the truth on her side. Daniels scoffed, his lips curling into a thin smile. "You've been talking a lot, Miss Andrews. But the truth isn't always as clear-cut as you think it is." His eyes shifted toward Mitchell. "And you," he said, his voice low, "you're just a pawn. You have no idea what you're playing with." Tasha could feel the surge of anger rise within her. But she didn't let it show. She focused, as always, on what mattered. The truth. It was all that mattered now. "You're right about one thing," Tasha said, stepping forward slightly. "The truth isn't always clear-cut, but the truth about you, Officer Daniels, is, and it's about time everyone knew what kind of person you really are." Her words hung in the air as she took a deep breath, gathering the strength to expose him once and for all. Daniels was so sure of his power, so confident that he could walk into this room and intimidate her into silence. But what he didn't know was that the truth had already been set in motion. It was too late for him to stop it now. "You've harassed me in public," Tasha continued, her voice growing firmer. "Threatened me with your power, and tried to make me feel small. But that's not even the worst part." "No, Officer Daniels. The worst part is that you and your colleagues are part of a system that keeps people like me in check. People who look like me. You've been part of a system built on fear and injustice, and now, the world is seeing it." The room was silent as Daniels glared at her, his expression darkening. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, especially not by someone he had thought would bow to his authority. "You think you've won?" Daniels spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you can just waltz in here and accuse me of things I didn't do? You think I'm the problem? You have no idea how deep this runs. You don't know what you're up against." Tasha didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed on, her resolve hardening. "I know exactly what I'm up against," she said, her voice unwavering. "But you've underestimated me. You've underestimated all of us, and that's where you've gone wrong, because I'm not alone anymore. The truth is bigger than you, and it's bigger than your badge." Daniels took a step toward her, his face twisted in rage. "You're making a huge mistake, Andrews," he growled. "You think you can just stir up trouble and walk away unscathed? You think I'm scared of your words? You're not the one in control here, I am." The words hung in the air, thick with menace, but Tasha didn't cower. She'd heard worse, seen worse, and nothing was going to stop her now. "Not anymore," she replied, her voice quiet, but filled with an undeniable force. "You've lost. The truth is already out. And you can't control that. You can't control what's coming next." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the doors burst open once again. The courtroom went still, as a man in a sharp suit walked in, his presence commanding immediate attention. It was the mayor, a man who had been quiet during the entire investigation, his hands seemingly clean. Tasha's stomach twisted. If he was here now, it meant that something big was happening, and she wasn't sure if it was for her benefit or against it. "Officer Daniels," the mayor said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I believe it's time we had a conversation about your future. You've been a liability for far too long." Tasha's heart skipped a beat as the mayor's words hit like a hammer. She'd suspected that Daniels was part of something larger, but now it was becoming clearer. The mayor's presence, his cold, businesslike demeanor, confirmed what she had feared. This wasn't just about a single corrupt officer, it was about a system that had allowed him to thrive for so long. "Sir," Daniels stammered, his defiance faltering in the face of the mayor's unyielding stance. I don't know what you mean, I'm just doing my job." The mayor shook his head. "You've done far more than your job, Daniels. You've broken the law, and you've allowed others to do the same. Your time is up." Tasha took a step back, the weight of the moment sinking in. The mayor was turning against Daniels. But why now? What had changed? "Your actions have consequences," the mayor continued, his tone colder than ever. "And now you'll face them." Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but the mayor cut him off with a simple motion. "It's over, Daniels. You've lost, you're done." As the mayor's words sank in, Tasha's eyes narrowed. It wasn't over. Not yet, but it was a turning point. The world was starting to see the truth, and no matter what happened from here on out, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop, she wasn't going to let them win. But as Daniels was escorted out of the room by two other officers, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of the battle was still to come. She had exposed one man, but the system that protected him, protected all of them, was still intact. The mayor turned to her, his eyes calculating. "This isn't over, Andrews. You've made your point, but there's still a lot to be done." Tasha didn't respond immediately. She knew this was only the beginning. The fight had only just started, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing was clear. She wasn't backing down. And this fight was far from finished. The days after the confrontation were a whirlwind. Tasha could feel the weight of her actions in the way people looked at her now. Everywhere she went, there were whispers, but not the kind of whispers that belittled or mocked her. These were whispers of admiration, of solidarity. People were beginning to see her for what she truly was. Someone who fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, ignored, or mistreated. Her fight had become their fight. Her voice was no longer just her own, it was the voice of countless others who had felt the sting of injustice but had never been able to speak out. As much as she wanted to savor this moment of victory, Tasha knew it wasn't over. Daniels may have been removed from the force, but the system that allowed him to operate unchecked was still very much alive. There were still more officers like him, more people whose actions were protected by the same unspoken code of silence. But Tasha had made a promise to herself. She wasn't going to stop until the system itself changed. The press conference after the showdown had brought even more attention to her cause. News outlets across the country had picked up the story, not just about Daniels, but about the system he represented. They covered the details of his abuse, his power, and the countless others who had suffered because of it. The public outcry was swift and loud. People were demanding accountability, not just for one officer, but for the entire police force. This wasn't just a local issue, it was a national one. But the real shift, the one that made Tasha believe change was possible, came when she received an unexpected call from the mayor's office. "Tasha, I wanted to speak with you directly," the mayor said, his voice different from the cold one he'd used during their earlier confrontation. "I've had time to reflect on everything that's come to light. You were right. This system, this whole department, needs to be reformed. We can't let this continue." Tasha wasn't sure if she should feel vindicated or wary. The mayor's sudden change of heart didn't feel entirely sincere, but there was something different in his tone. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps guilt, but it was there. And for the first time, Tasha sensed that real change might be on the horizon. "We're initiating an independent review of the department, a third-party investigation, one that doesn't involve anyone currently in the system," he continued. "I'm also working with several community leaders to establish a civilian oversight committee that will help monitor police actions from now on. We need more transparency, Tasha, more accountability." The mayor's words were a step in the right direction, but Tasha knew this was only the beginning. The review could easily be stalled, the oversight committee could be undermined, but she didn't have time to dwell on the what-ifs. Her eyes were already set on the future, on making sure that the change wasn't just talk, but real action. As she sat back in her office, Tasha felt the exhaustion of the last few months catch up to her. The weight of the fight had been heavy, but the satisfaction of knowing that she had made a dent in the armor of systemic racism was enough to push her forward. She wasn't done. Not yet. Mitchell, ever the ally, had stayed by her side throughout the media frenzy, helping her navigate the attention and the occasional hostility that came with it. He had helped write op-eds, he had given interviews, and he had stood in front of cameras, urging the community to hold their leaders accountable. But in private moments, Tasha could tell how much he admired her. He had watched her change from someone who hesitated to speak up into someone who demanded action, who knew how to rally people to her cause. "We've made progress," Mitchell said one afternoon, as they reviewed the latest polling data on public opinion regarding police reform. "The numbers are showing more support for your cause than we could have hoped for. People are seeing that this isn't just about one bad cop. It's about all the officers, all the systems, that allow this kind of abuse to continue." Tasha looked at the data, nodding. "It's encouraging. Yes. But I won't rest until we see real change, until I know that those who have been complicit, who have stood by and watched, are held accountable too." Her words rang with the same certainty they had when she first started this journey. She hadn't just been fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for every injustice swept under the rug. And yet, there were moments, like now, when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. It was a lot to carry. The pain, the anger, the fear. And as much as she'd told herself that she was strong enough to handle it, she couldn't deny that she was tired. But there was still work to be done. In the days that followed, Tasha worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, meeting with activists, and continuing to push the mayor's office for the reforms they had promised. She traveled to other cities, speaking at rallies, encouraging people to stay vigilant, to continue calling out the injustices that had plagued their communities for too long. And the people listened. But even as her public profile grew, and her cause gained more traction, Tasha could sense that the forces she was up against weren't backing down. She received more threats, anonymous phone calls, veiled warnings, and even the occasional intimidating encounter. But each time, Tasha stood firm. She had come too far to back down now. One evening, as she returned home after a long day of meetings, she found an envelope waiting for her on the doorstep. No return address, just her name, written in bold, scrawling letters. Her pulse quickened as she opened it, and inside, she found a single piece of paper, a crude drawing of a noose, with the words, "You're next." Tasha's heart raced, and for a moment, fear gnawed at her. But then she took a deep breath and smiled. They thought they could scare her into silence. They thought they could break her, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. As she placed the note down, Tasha's resolve solidified. This was exactly what they wanted. For her to be afraid, to feel isolated, to question whether the fight was worth it. But she would never let them win. She would stand up, no matter the threats, no matter the cost. The days ahead would be difficult. She knew the road was long, that the change she sought would not come easily, but she wasn't backing down. She wasn't done. And as she went to bed that night, the weight of her decision settled in her chest, like a steady, reassuring drumbeat. No matter how many times they tried to push her down, she would rise. She wasn't done. The fight for justice had only just begun, and she was determined to see it through. Tasha sat quietly in her office, the weight of the journey settling over her like a heavy mantle. She had come so far, but in some ways, she knew that her battle was just beginning. The events of the past few months had changed her in ways she hadn't fully realized until now. What had started as an individual struggle against a single officer's cruelty had grown into something much larger. A fight against systemic injustice. Tasha had not just uncovered the flaws of one officer, she had peeled back the layers of a system that was broken. A system that favored power over fairness, comfort over truth. In those quiet moments of reflection, she thought about how different her life had become since that day in the courthouse. Back then, she was just a successful, quiet woman, confident in her professional life, but uncertain in the face of blatant injustice. She had been forced into the position of leader, of activist, against her will, and at first, she hadn't known how to handle it. Now, however, it felt like a mantle she was born to carry. The weight didn't feel as heavy anymore. She wasn't just doing this for herself, she was doing it for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every person who had ever been dismissed or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. Tasha's strength had always been in her ability to keep moving forward. But now, after everything, she realized that her true strength lay not in moving forward alone, but in bringing others along with her. She had learned to speak out, to stand firm, and, most importantly, to inspire others to do the same. Her fight had sparked a chain reaction that was rippling across the city, challenging not just the individuals who had wronged her, but the entire system that allowed their actions to persist unchecked. But Tasha knew that no matter how many steps she took toward justice, the journey would never be easy. There would always be those who would fight against change, who would seek to preserve the status quo. She had seen it in the disdain of Officer Daniels, in the subtle microaggressions of people who doubted her place in the world, in the veiled threats that followed her wherever she went. And yet, every time she faced adversity, every time she was threatened or underestimated, she fought back with more resilience, more determination. The power she had once only used to navigate the high echelons of her career was now focused on something far more important: justice. The community's response had been overwhelming. People from all walks of life had reached out to her, sharing their own experiences, their own struggles with systemic racism and the police force. It wasn't just Tasha's story that resonated. It was the collective experience of everyone who had been ignored, oppressed, or silenced. Through Tasha's courage, the city had found a voice. People who had once felt powerless now saw the possibility of change. The protests, the public meetings, the media coverage, they had all converged into a wave of momentum that couldn't be ignored. Yet even in the midst of all the attention, Tasha's path was far from clear. The mayor's promises of reform felt like a first step. But they were just that. Only a step. Tasha knew that real change would require more than just new policies or the removal of one officer. It would require the dismantling of entire systems built on inequality, the disruption of a structure that had been in place for generations. There were still many battles to fight, many people to convince, many walls to break down. But Tasha was ready. She had already faced her greatest fears. She had stood up in the face of ridicule, been dragged through the mud in the media, and had her life threatened. But none of that had broken her spirit. She had learned that true power came from her ability to remain steadfast, to never stop pushing, to never let herself be silenced. As she reflected on the journey, Tasha found herself looking back on the people who had helped her along the way. The activists, the community leaders, and especially Mitchell. He had been there from the beginning, even when she hadn't known what to do, even when she was afraid to take the next step. His quiet support had been a lifeline. Tasha had learned that while individual actions were important, collective action was where the true strength lay. She had never been alone in this fight, and the more people rallied around her, the stronger she became. The larger implications of Tasha's fight had become clear to her over time. What had started as one woman's struggle against the police had now become a symbol of resistance against the entrenched systems of power that permeated every facet of society. The personal had become political. Tasha had seen the ways in which systemic racism and abuse of power had pervaded not just the police force, but schools, businesses, and governments across the country. The fight she was engaged in wasn't just about justice for one person. It was about creating a world where such injustices could no longer be ignored, where people could no longer be oppressed without consequence. And yet, Tasha didn't feel anger anymore. What she felt now was something far more powerful. Hope. Hope that things could change. Hope that if enough people stood together, they could force that change into being hope that the next generation wouldn't have to face the same battles she had fought. Her actions had set something in motion, something far greater than any one individual could achieve. The process of reform in the police department was already underway, but the ripples of Tasha's efforts were being felt beyond law enforcement. Community organizations were now pushing for more inclusive practices in businesses, schools, and local government. People were talking about race, about justice, in ways they never had before Tasha had become a figurehead, not just for police reform, but for the larger struggle for equality in every facet of society. But Tasha knew that even though things were changing, the fight wasn't over. She couldn't rest on the progress that had been made, because the work was ongoing. There would always be new fights, new barriers to break down, new people to lift up and support. The struggle for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, but she had learned that as long as people stood together, change was possible. And Tasha knew that she would always be there, standing at the forefront of that fight, pushing for a world that was more just, more equal, and more compassionate. She would continue to speak out, to challenge the status quo, to lead by example, and show others that they too could make a difference. As Tasha prepared to leave her office for the day, she thought about how far she had come. She had started as a woman who was just trying to survive, just trying to make her way in a world that constantly tried to push her down. But now, she was a woman who had found her voice, who had ignited a fire in others, who had shown that one person's fight could change the world. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better because of her. And that, Tasha realized, was all she could ask for.